very brief introduction. I mean, the reason we do events, we are doing event on Kashmir, and we can explain that later. So in a sense, explanation can come towards the end, why we decided to do this event, or these kinds of event. But for our department, it's part and parcel of our interests in emerging powers, but emerging powers not as powers, but as emerging powers in terms of looking at India and China and other countries critically. So for instance, we do a lot of events on Tibet. And now this is on Kashmir, but we see it as part and parcel of bigger events and conferences we want to do on stateless nations. So on Kurdistan, on Baloch, on Somaliland, that's part and parcel of what we want to do. But I don't want to spend more time on discussing ourselves today, but in terms of, I would like to invite the first three speakers on stage here, and it will be panel discussion. We'll start with Mirza Waheed there. Could you please join us? Mirza Waheed is a writer, a novelist, and also a journalist. He was born and brought up in Kashmir, the Indian-occupied Kashmir. His debut novel, The Collaborator, was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award, the Shakti Bhatt Prize, and Desmond Elliott Prize. Now, I'm not going to read the entire biography because you would already be aware of it, but I'm reading it because we are recording the event, and our audience is not only you and us here, but also beyond through YouTube in a few days' time. Second speaker we have is Victoria Schofield. Please join us. She's a historian and commentator on international affairs with specialist knowledge of South Asia. Her books include Kashmir in Conflict, India, Pakistan, and the Unending War, and Afghan Frontier at the Crossroads of Conflict. And she's a frequent contributor to various TV channels and newspapers and radio stations. And third speaker we have is Dr. Nitasha Kaul. She's a Kashmiri novelist, poet, scholar, and commentator. Her Man Asian Literary Prize shortlisted novel Residue has recently been published through Rainlight of Rupa in 2014. And we'll talk about the book later towards the end of this session. Again, she has also written fiction and poetry, and she's also an academic and a scholar. You can join us here, unless you can't find your bag, okay. And I'm Dibyesh. And this is more of a conversation between us. But part of the purpose is, we know, most of you already know quite a bit about Kashmir. But some of our audience, including our students at the back, they may not know much about the context. So we'll assume that we'll try to balance between those who know a lot about the issue and those who don't know much about the issue. So we'll try our level best to balance that. Thank you very much anyway for coming, and we'll start with the first question, which is, let me sit first. So in fact, I would like to start with Waheed, you. I mean, you're next to me and your name is first. I mean, could you, say specifically those who don't know much about the issue here, what is this Kashmir issue all about?
Short answer. The Kashmir issue, as in your description you talk about, cartographic dimensions to the issue, territorial tug of war between India and Pakistan, and so on and so forth, which have now become these cliches, actually, because the narrative of Kashmir has moved beyond those frameworks. Because as we speak now, there has been a new wave of resistance, dissent going on in Kashmir for a decade. Much of it is not the armed rebellion that we saw in the 90s. The issue, the core issue, is the same, which is about the destiny of Kashmiris, all Kashmiris, and the two powers that sit on either side of us have been intransigent and quite stubborn and rigid. And as far as the Indian presence in Kashmir goes, a very brutal occupation, to put it plainly and simply. And the occupation continues. There are hundreds and thousands of soldiers in Kashmir as we speak. When Indian commentators or the press or the state talk about elections and democracy, all wonderful things, all those things stop before they get to Kashmir. Can I load an image? Is it possible? The issue is the same. Kashmiris have been denied this chance to decide their future historically. And the denial continues, primarily from India, but also from Pakistan. When I say primarily from India, because India is the occupying power in Kashmir in these days, If you look at these images, I've been particularly disturbed by these, what I call, these are the imprints of Indian occupation on Kashmiri children. One of them, this boy, is from Baramulla. And there's a recent image. This is during the recent parliamentary elections, which were also conducted in Kashmir, with a low, very low turnout in the valley, of course. And this boy is about 12, and he was hit by what is known locally as a pellet gun, which are technically buckshot weapons. These were introduced in Kashmir to reduce the number of killings, because in 2010 and before that, 2008, 2009, Indian police, Indian armed forces, Indian paramilitaries would basically shoot to kill if there were protesters on the streets. And most of the protesters are this age, they're teenagers or 20-year-old people. The other photograph is of a boy who was blinded. And the small starscape you see in his skull are pellets embedded in the skull. There's an X-ray of this boy's head. Now, you see these images and you say, okay, this goes on in Kashmir. It's been going on for a long, long time. People are killed brutally on the streets, murdered. And I grew up in Kashmir, if any of you don't know. I witnessed this firsthand. You lose friends, relatives. You see this kind of brutality every day. But this is recent. One would have thought that the Indian state may have changed its methods when it comes to crushing dissent. But I see this is brutal. These are children. And when you tell people, they don't believe you. We were talking about challenges of Kashmir. Even now, in 2014, I circulated this one picture recently, and I got lots of abuse. I don't think much of online media, online abuse and everything, but it was a window into the success of the state narrative and the narratives in much of the mainstream media. There isn't much of a difference between official narratives and the narratives in the media. And a lot of people came back and said this is a fake picture. And at first you're amused, you think, these are silly people, what do they know? But they kept going on for weeks, that this is a fabricated picture. And it occurs to you, things haven't changed much. Because you won't find this picture on the front pages of the newspapers, big newspapers in India, or probably in some sections of the press in Pakistan either. Or they don't make primetime TV in India. So which means the so-called common Indian or Pakistani, primarily Indian, thinks that these are Kashmiris going on and on about their victimhood, and they just keep crying and moaning and so on and so forth. Which is, apart from being insulting and offensive, which presents a very structural problem, structural issue in the narratives around Kashmir. So successful are the obfuscatory narratives spun by the state, ably helped by their errand boys in the media, that people just refuse to believe it, that this cannot happen. And one of the common refrains that came up was, India can't do that. Our forces can't do that. Indian police can't do that. Indian army can't do that. But this is what they do, and they have been doing that for nearly 25 years, and before that as well. The challenge then is, what do you do? What do you say to these people? What do you say to what do you do in a political atmosphere where your basic assumptions are challenged and called into question? And these are not an assumption, these are facts. I got these images especially for this session because I had been disturbed that how do we, if this happened in let's say the Middle East, if this was an image from Saudi Arabia where the police are crushing protesters, or Iran, or the Arab world, they would be all over the press. They would be, human rights organizations would be, in an overdrive. And I don't mean no disrespect to human rights organizations. But none of this happens. There are small mentions here and there. The only media entity that covered this story, this boy is one of the many blinded youth of Kashmir. They don't have, some of them have lost, it's a total loss of vision. Because these pellets, these nasty pieces of weaponry, that get into your body, in your eyes, in your head, and you don't even get treatment because the structure of occupation in Kashmir is so complete, is so brutal, is built on this narrative of indignity and humiliation, that when you go to hospitals with this kind of injury, at first you don't go because you know there's going to be spies inside hospitals who will report you back to the police. So you don't go, which means you lose precious time. And, if some of these boys, their vision could have been saved, but they can't, they're scared. They're fearful of going to hospitals because they're reported back to the police, which means there'll be a nighttime raid next day or the day after. They'll take you away. If not you, they'll take your parents away and beat them. And many of these people, scores of them, have lost vision, either a partial or total loss of vision. This is now, as we speak, when we are talking about, there are these two new governments in place, both in India and Pakistan, with heavy mandates and strong prime ministers, to put it mildly. But I don't foresee a lot of change. There have been people who've been talking about it is, right-wing leaders or strong leaders are more likely to help solve a chronic conflict, for want of a better word. But I don't think so, because what will they do? If they are not willing to depart from the traditional, deeply entrenched narratives on Kashmir, very strict positions on Kashmir, which, as we will probably discuss at some point, are territorial essentially, and they do not take into account the aspirations of the Kashmiri people, nothing is going to change, sadly. And that is the main point of discussion and debate, and that should be the main point of discussion, that when do we see Kashmiris on the table? Because if you do not bring them to the table, this is going to carry on, and you're helping raise a new generation of Kashmiris who are not going to be happy at all, whose sense of estrangement and whose sense of I would say hostility towards the state is complete and justified, I must emphasize. They do not want India at all. I do not want India and Kashmir. Personally speaking, I want both the armies to leave and let all Kashmiris sit together and decide what we want to be, what kind of a state we want to be, what kind of a nation we want to be. But people need to, Indian citizens, it's not, I don't want to broad brush this. There are sections in Indian society, Indian civil society, who have started to look at Kashmir with fresh empathy and understanding, and they do not call us liars all the time, only sometimes, when it doesn't suit them. But there are sections who are willing to question the state's actions in Kashmir, and which is a positive sign. That's probably been one of the only few positive developments in the last 10 years, that there are sections in both countries that are willing to look Kashmir away from the prism of territorial war. Long answer, sorry.
No, but it's a very interesting answer. And in fact, Victoria, could you expand, what is this territorial narrative? We know that, and this is the framework, this is how we frame the conference, and Waheed also pointed out, that often India and Pakistan see it as a territorial conflict. Could you expand on what is this territorial conflict? What is in India or Pakistan's interest when it comes to Kashmir?
Yes, well, as Mirza rightly says, the root of the issue in 1947 was very much about territory. Nobody was particularly interested in polling people's rights, although remarkably there was a departure very swiftly from merely regarding Kashmir as a territorial issue, but right at the beginning, as an independent princely state in former British India. At the time of partition, all the princely states were really supposed to have chosen, the rulers had the right to choose which new dominion they wanted to join. And the reason Kashmir is so special is because it lies geographically between the two countries, as you know, between India and Pakistan. And it had a majority Muslim population, but it had a Hindu ruler. And as I've just said, the ruler had, according to the British partition plan, it was up to the ruler to decide. There was a sort of proviso, a recommendation really given And it shows you how sort of amateurish all this was when you look back on it, that the rulers should take account of the aspirations of their population, but there was nothing hard and fast in this partition plan. And as it happens exceptionally, the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir didn't decide. He vacillated. He thought actually probably that he would keep his state independent if he possibly could, because he didn't like what he considered to be the communalism inherent in the two-nation theory, because although he had majority Muslims, he had a great number of Hindus, he had Sikhs, and also the area of Ladakh, sparsely populated, but nonetheless there were Buddhists. So it was really more difficult than simply just saying it's a majority Muslim state, let it go to Pakistan. And he chose not to do anything. And essentially the rest is history, because within 2 months, well, from August to October, Pakistan was getting uneasy. It had signed a standstill agreement that would continue with communications, and it was getting uneasy that India was actually getting ready to move in and take over Kashmir. And then you get this instance, which we have here, Andrew Whitehead, and perhaps we'll hear later, in his book, he talks a lot about the tribal invasion, which is very interesting, because you get people now saying that the tribal invasion, that's tribals, again, if you equate them with modern-day people, they were from the northwest frontier, from the federal-administered FATA area of Pakistan, and they came in their thousands in trucks into Kashmir, and this made the Maharaja very nervous. Therefore, he requested help from the Indian government. And again, the British were still pulling the strings. It's very interesting. One has to sort of not look at it with the wisdom of hindsight, because there were 2 British officers still in charge of both the Indian and Pakistani armies. And I think this is, again, interesting for students of history to realize that independence was a very new phenomenon. Britain still had a big control of what went on. And the Governor-General Mountbatten was concerned that there would be what he called an inter-dominion war if these 2 countries went to war over, as I say, again, essentially a piece of territory. He suggested there should be this temporary accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India. And as I say, the objective was to avert an inter-dominion war. In fact, what happened was creating, the problem that we have today. But this is where it's very interesting. It was Mountbatten who suggested that this temporary accession should be confirmed by a referendum, reference to the people, or a plebiscite. So often we consider that the plebiscite was a creation of the United Nations, but actually the plebiscite was suggested. And it's interesting that Mountbatten had in his mind that this accession really, it needed confirmation of the inhabitants. And so this is where, for the first time, you get introduced the aspirations of the inhabitants of the state. And as I say, this is often lost sight of. The United Nations was then brought in to effect a ceasefire so that the conditions could be created to hold this plebiscite. And it's the fact that the plebiscite hasn't been held, which means the Kashmiris, as Mirza would say, have not yet had their right of self-determination. So it moved from being a territorial dispute, which it was at the beginning, to being a dispute where the rights of the inhabitants were sort of written into the narrative. And I've always felt that you now have a dispute on 2 levels. You have one which is a straight territorial dispute where for many years Pakistan was anticipating that the whole state would become part of Pakistan. There was a lot of discussion in terms of Pakistan not being fully itself as a state because it didn't have Kashmir, the vital K in the word Pakistan, etc. But underlying that and really underwriting that, you had a dispute which was about the rights of individuals. And I'll just finish on this note, because very swiftly it became obvious that this plebiscite was not going to be held. And one of the negotiators was Sir Owen Dixon, who went to both sides. As we know, the state was divided along the ceasefire line the official ceasefire started in 1949, 1/3 roughly retained by Pakistan, 2/3, including the Valley of Kashmir, retained by India. But Sir Owen Dixon, he realized that, and there's quite an interesting statement he makes, he says, the two parties have agreed there should be a plebiscite, but so far they have not agreed the method of how they're going to put this plebiscite. And that was in 1950, before, of course, the government of India then said, well, the plebiscite's no longer necessary. So this was the setting of the scene for this dispute, a territorial dispute, but also about the right of people to choose their destiny.
Okay, thank you. In fact, very interesting how, of course, when empires were built and then post-colonial states were being formed, it was largely about territory, though nationalism made an argument on the basis of people. And yet when it came to Kashmiris, the two states involved focused more on the territory than on the people. Now, Nitasha, I mean, if we come back to today, because again, as Waheed also pointed out, people are talking of new, fresh change with, democratic government in Pakistan, and of course, a right-wing democratically elected government in India, and all of that. I mean, could you say more on why? I mean, given that India, let's focus more on India in this case. India is so-called democracy or has a democratic form of government. Why does the conflict still exist? And why are people, for instance, not more understanding of the kind of indignities that Kashmiris undergo under Indian rule?
Right. Well, yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because when I was hearing Mirza and Victoria speak, that is, I was, and make these points that they've essentially laid the groundwork, the background for what I wanted to begin with, which is to say that democracy as a concept in today's world, I think, is hugely overrated, and because we do not distinguish between substantive and procedural democracy. What does a democracy mean to most people? It means once every certain 4 or 5 years, you go and you cast a vote, and and you've done the democratic duty, and therefore you're living in a democracy. But actually, substantively, democracy has to do with the rights of people. It is ruled by the people, and that can only happen. That is, the demos can only have the rule if they are being represented. And if there is no representation in the government of the people that the government is supposed to be governing, then it cannot really be called a democracy. And so, in a sense, that when we look at these post-colonial states of India and Pakistan, what happened when the British left is that they had all these border regions, you could, like Kashmir in India, or Balochistan in Pakistan, or all these border regions that had a completely different set up and had to some extent either suzerainty or some level of sovereignty of them, in their own right. And at that point, they, for whatever reasons, and now the rulers obviously were ambiguous because they weren't, they were looking out for their own interests, and they wanted to get the best possible, which meant either liaising with the British or with the two new governments, and they kind of held on to that for as long as they could. Until the point at which they were either by force or by annexation or by coercion or by somehow some kind of legal instruments, they were then incorporated into these states without consultation of the will of the people, as Victoria was talking about. Firstly, and then of course there's the other point that Britain itself was an empire run by a democracy. So if democracies are these wonderful, brilliant things that look out for the rights of the people, it's not entirely sure and hasn't been sure to us in history. Yes, democracy as a concept is really valuable, but then you have to look at it as a substantive concept, whether it does deliver on the ground. And it seems that in these post-colonial states, it doesn't. And then, of course, and now we have these, Mirza made this very valid point, and this is being said in India all the time. Now that we have a right-wing government, they have a strong mandate, and they're going to solve the problem. Well, to an extent, they're able to have these kind of showmanship gestures of inviting all the SARC leaders and all of that, because they won't be labeled anti-national if they did it. Unlike other governments, if somebody else did it, they would be called anti-national for doing things like that. But on the actual, real, substantive process of making a difference, they're not going to be able to do anything. One, because the people that they get their support from have not signed up to that agenda. So if this right-wing, huge nationwide paramilitary that has brought this party to power is not going to be happy with a democratic resolution of the issue that involves not talking about Kashmir as the Atut Ang or the Abhin Ang or whatever the new language that they use. So one, because of that, it's not going to happen. And secondly, it's not in their interests to happen. happen. I mean, if to them economics is continuation of politics by other means. They're not interested in the political resolution. They're interested in the trade, in the business. I mean, it is a government that means business, but quite literally means business. And you can see that from the discussions that happen in the Indian media right now, ranging from talking about corporate tax as tax terrorism to, to erosion of the rights of people when they talk about repealing or discussions on Article 370 in Kashmir. Now, Article 370 is something that we may talk about. But so when they raise issues like that, they're not actually even trying to solve the problem. So that's one aspect, which is to do with democracy and the problems inherited by the post-colonial states, which were then worsened by what they themselves did, which is they gradually eroded whatever sovereignty these places had. So whatever status Kashmir had in terms of, when India became independent, gradually over time got eroded, at every step when the governments were removed, when the titles of the, Prime Minister of Kashmir became the chief, Sheikh Abdullah's time when he came back to power. So there was this gradual erosion of sovereignty of whatever sovereignty they possess, till the point at which right now they live under an occupation. So there's that point. And then secondly, there's this other issue of the good and bad victims. Kashmiris are not good victims. They are bad victims. They are Muslims. They don't have oil. Now, increasingly with this kind of the right-wing governments, you can actually safely assume that the international interest in Kashmir, at least of the other governments, is probably going to be lesser, because now there is a government that actually has this business agenda, and so it's going to even more tie up even better with its regional partners, places like China, but also with more in the wider international world. So it's actually going to, I think, international dimension of interest in Kashmir. We'll have to work harder, in other words, if you want to look at it positively. We'll have to work harder to keep problems like this in people's minds, because these are bad victims. They're Muslims, and and India is a democracy, and Indian Army is doing the good thing. They're doing this whole kind of this, the imperial. It's like the replication of the imperial project. And the other thing is that it's the issue of representation. I think is really central. Whether it comes to when we look at how when Victoria was saying that people were not consulted, and and people's wills, and as Mirza said, that people's rights or aspirations are not taken into account and they live under an occupation. It's the same as, say, for instance, when it's not the same, but what I mean is that it's a similar kind of mechanism, like when the Western governments go and give a huge amount of loan at a very bad with very bad conditionality to a state somewhere that is not representative of its people, and then the people have to spend the rest of their lives being under that burden, cutting off their social services. So it's that whole mechanism where essentially, when it's either politics or economics, the idea of representation is not taken seriously when it comes to the real people who have to bear with the consequences of that. And I think I'm actually with the new government, I think I'm actually it's very depressing. I think that it's going to lead to even more polarization if you listen to just the way they've started to talk within just a few days when they're talking about Kashmir.
Yeah. So in fact, I mean, few things you raised and all of you have been raising is, in certain sense, we can see the Indian rule in Kashmir as very much colonial kind of rule, because it's using the word occupation. So if we look at from perspective of many Kashmiris, they would see it as a colonial kind of occupation. You also use an example of West giving certain kind of loan, and then of course people having to repay for their entire life, even when it was not them who took it. So there's a certain kind of neo-colonial control also that India imposes through maybe economic dominance of Kashmir. And of course, for those of you who may not know, I mean, the current right-wing government, one of its important supporters has been RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. This is the right-wing paramilitary you were talking about. And the Atutang, I mean, the language that India often uses, or Indians use, not necessarily India, but Indians uses, Kashmir is an integral part. Not Kashmiris, but Kashmir. So it doesn't matter, all Kashmiris can be killed, but Kashmir remains an integral part of India. That's the kind of territorial language that they use. I mean, Waheed, could you expand more on, because we use the word occupation, right? I mean, I know you gave example of pellet injury and certain kind of, could you expand more on, I mean, how does, let's say, an occupied, because let's say, most of us here may not have experienced occupation ourselves. Maybe our own identity could be connected to that of an occupier, not all, but some of us. Could you give more examples of how, I mean, daily life of Kashmiris may be affected through certain kind of indignities imposed by that occupation?
Can I go back to the two-tongue, question? It's a strange kind of a two-tongue that this Indian state wants to break all the time, like this, and hurt it and enjoy it and brutalize it. So I don't really understand what do they mean by a two-tongue when this part you keep you make sure that you want to hurt it to the point of disfigurement. And if we talk about democracy, I mean, is a very fraught subject. It expresses itself in all kinds of ways in all parts of all kinds of parts of the world. This is how it blossoms in Kashmir. Occupation as a lived experience. I grew up in that space, and you breathe that space. It's essentially colonized space, as you said. And how it manifests itself is like one evening you may be told that from tomorrow you're not going to get out of your house because we have decided to impose a curfew or shoot at sight. And we don't even want to tell you why or for how long because it doesn't matter. So from now onwards, for the next 70 days, you will stay indoors. We don't care about what happens to you, where you get your food from. You may have old people in the house or children. They may want milk or medicines or so on and so forth. It doesn't matter to us. That is how you live occupation. Or you are occupied when your son or brother or husband or father is taken away in the middle of the night and no answers are given. We decide to take him away, and then we will not even bother to tell you where this person is, or if he's alive at all, or if he's in a dungeon somewhere in Rajasthan or Delhi. Or years may pass. You may knock on our doors of the legal structures which belong to the occupying state, I must emphasize. But we won't tell you because we don't care. Because we are a powerful country and we hold you by force. Or we may torture your 14-year-old boy and leave him, half dead in a ditch somewhere. It doesn't matter. The ideas of justice and do not even enter the conversation, let alone initiate a process. There are these women in this village. They may have been raped. It doesn't matter to us. They may have been murdered. We can tell you that they drowned in knee-deep water, and you have to accept this state version because we are the occupying power. And all you can do is cry about victimhood and your narratives. But it doesn't really matter to us because we are a big international power and we get to decide what happens. However, this kind of bleak scenario is punctured by the people who survived, who lived through this, who decided not to forget and not to move on. Because we hear this often by the voices hired by these neo-colonial states that come on, move on, let bygones be bygones. It's okay. Look, our economy is doing very well. You may reap some benefits as well. There'll be cell phones and 3G and 4G. Why are you harping on about thousands of people in prison? Or why are you going on and on about thousands of people who were subject to enforced disappearances? Or women who are called half widows because they don't know what happened to their husbands. So why are you going on and on about it? Here is a Samsung new phone, or we're going to bring you new internet connections or cell phones. Or you may even get jobs in these small enterprises that we will sort of try and install there. That is what occupation means. But a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old from downtown Srinagar or Sopore or Baramulla or Anantnag understands all of this. It does not require, trust me, I go home everywhere, I spend time what can you do? You live in another city for various reasons. But I go home everywhere, and you talk, you meet people, you meet family and friends. A 12-year-old girl from downtown Srinagar sees through all this. She does not require a Mirza Waheed or a Victoria Schofield or a Nitasha Kaul to explain these things to her, with due respects to the work we do. But they see through it. They live it every day. They see what it means. They see what the soldier taking a stroll by your kitchen window means. They know exactly what it means. And they have decided that we're not going to accept this. No matter how long it takes, no matter what it takes, no matter what you do to the body of the Kashmiri. You may brutalize him, her. You may just sometimes, what used to happen in the 90s or even later than that, Indian forces, Indian police, they would take away young men and execute them, in a wooded area or on the road, and then disfigure their faces, and then next day have a press conference and say we had a major operation, successful operation against terrorists, and major breakthrough. These are 5 dreaded militants they will take a scary sounding name from an area in Pakistan, and they would use, grand names for jihadist figures and say this is Abu so-and-so of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and we have successfully managed to liquidate him. Turns out, in many cases, these were farmers or students or people just going on about their work. And those stories come out. The cupboard is full of skeletons, and they keep tumbling out, no matter what you do, no matter how mighty the narrative of the mainstream media is against this kind of politics. But they keep tumbling out, and that's what happens. I was also going to end with, Parveena Ahangarji is here, and Nobel Peace nominee, and many other such honors. We've all followed her life, I don't want to say story, for a long, long time. And she's been probably one of the bravest women in Kashmir who've taken it upon themselves to fight what I was talking about, relentlessly, against unimaginable odds. You cannot imagine what it is to live in that space and yet protest and say, we want justice, and I'm not going to let you off the hook. And sometimes one feels as a writer, that people like us, academics, writers, or activists, you feel like you think that you should take a back seat when those who are fighting in the trenches of this struggle against a brutal occupation. And I feel that we should, when it's time for her to speak, every word is important and counts, because we do not get opportunities like this very often. I have never even met Parveena ji, but I followed her life since '94, I think. And it's a great moment and thank you to the university and Dibyesh and Goldie to kind of bring her in, because this is firsthand. This is, you asked me about what it is to live as an occupied being, as an occupied person. This is it, that at great personal tragedy, notwithstanding that, you rise up and say, I am going to fight not just my battle, but many, many battles of people like me.
Okay, thanks. In fact, so what we see is, that whole idea of uncertainty, that you don't know what would happen to you or your son or your daughter or your parent next day, that kind of uncertainty. Of course, the practice of enforced disappearance, which would be the emphasis in the next panel when we'd have Parveena Ahangarji speaking to us, right? And enforced disappearance is the idea that, let's say, in this case, your son or someone, a person is disappeared, the state doesn't even acknowledge, or they may acknowledge that he or she has gone somewhere, but will not have the decency to inform you even what has happened to the person. It's like a kidnapping, official kidnapping, but a certain kind of arrogance where the state will not bother to tell what happens to the body.
Sorry, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's arrogant and so on and so forth, but it's structural,
Yeah.
it's systemic, it is part of the design. When we talk about, if we kind of read narratives of occupations in the last century and a half, it's easily understood that these are structured, systemic frameworks.
Yeah.
It is not an incident or an accident. It's not an aberration. It's not a mistake. That's what they sometimes call it in official press releases, that this was, sorry, oops, we killed your son. It was a mistake. It is not that. It is structural, it is systemic, it is part of a design to punish a population that is dead, to resist, to rise.
Yeah. So in fact, it's not about a case of few rotten apples. That's the kind of language that the state uses. In India case, they don't even use the word rotten apples. I mean, they don't even have that decency to acknowledge, which sometimes the Western governments do, that, okay, few of our soldiers did something wrong. In Indian context, for instance, you'll hardly come across a conscientious objector from the military challenging his own military's operation in certain parts of the world, certain parts like in Kashmir. Now, Nitasha, I mean, I'll go back to you. I mean, in terms of India, I mean, could you say more on how Indians see Kashmir? I mean, why can't they see through this kind of indignity that their government imposes on Kashmir? I mean, what is preventing them from seeing it? And what kind of maybe indignities Kashmiris face when they are in India?
Yeah. The imagination of the colonizer or the people who live within that bubble that is enabled by that colonization that they have done elsewhere. It's the same as if you were to ask me the question that when these things began to happen in Iraq and Afghanistan, and everybody here went about their business, and still we were at war somewhere else, and these people were dying, and are dying. How can we go about our lives? Doing everything that people do. It's the same sort of thing. One, there is an insulation that is built up in that society from the mainstream media. Secondly, that there's two levels. One, secondly, there's this thing that there's consumerism on the one hand, which is the entertainment. There's the IPL. People have cricket to watch in India. It's mega business. So there's all these kind of 1984 style distractions that make people not think about the things that matter. That's for a certain section of society. And then for a lot of the other section of society, which is actually probably, certainly not a minority, it is simply the struggle of their daily life, which is brutal under a very, very unequal society, which is also very comfortable with that growing inequality at some level. So it's that if you're not aspiring to already be part of that consumerist society and are not already a part of it and therefore insulated, then you're struggling to somehow just make ends meet. You're struggling because of things that would have to do with your identity in terms of your gender, in terms of your caste, in terms of your location. So every day it is not also surprising to hear about what else is happening in the rest of India. There are these Dalit girls raped and hung. There's 17-year-old is killed because of property dispute. There are all these rapes happening. So there's this other completely parallel level of brutalization that continues to keep these people, majority of society, in a perpetual state of just where every day is just a struggle. To not have died is the thing. You're not raped. You're not. None of that is happening to you. You're just somehow struggling to make ends meet. So there's that. Why they are not able to see it. And what happens to Kashmiris in the rest of India? The two recent incidents that you might be aware of is one, that there was this case where about 67 students were expelled from a university in India. Kashmiri students were expelled from a university in India. There was, for cheering Pakistan in a cricket match. There was cheering for Pakistan in a cricket match. There was another case where students were beaten up, Kashmiri students were beaten up and asked to say repeat the slogans, Pakistan, Murdabad, India Zindabad, which is basically long live India, down with Pakistan. So there is that, obviously they live under this state of discrimination and suspicion and alienation. And then there are these very overt and very brutal instances where they are forced, where not only is the body of Kashmir possessed, India wanting to possess the body of Kashmir, Then they have, these instances where bodies within Kashmir of individuals are subjected to this, and much worse. And then there are all these other people, in India who are Kashmiris who face that at a daily level, the discrimination. And last year, of course, as you might know, there was this case of Afzal Guru, who was, a Kashmiri who was hanged on the basis of circumstantial evidence. To satisfy, as the court said, the collective conscience of the Indian people, as if there's this kind of collective revenge agenda. And then his body was buried inside the prison. This is apparently some kind of old imperial colonial practice. So his relatives were not informed, and his body is buried within the prison, within the Indian prison. So I mean, at some level, it's very, very obvious, but then there are all these other agendas and struggles that make people not see that. If I might make a couple of other points, which is that, and then obviously the state thinks that it's all just about growth. If we just give them, and not that they seriously try to do so, but they think if we just give them these devices and give them the lure of, this lure of what they could get if they were a part of India, if they accepted to be a part of India. So these new phones and new phones and devices and the cafes and things like that. But even then, the discourse is within the Indian state. The discourse is that if we give them if we give them greater access to technology, that'll keep them away from thinking about politics. That's how they think, that they won't be out in the street pelting stones if they're busy on their computer. I've actually read reports where people say that this is why we should give them, that they won't be out in the streets. And secondly, obviously, it enables, from their point of view, a greater surveillance of what, and there's a lot of these preemptive detentions and arrests of people who haven't, who are just arrested because they are monitored all the time. So there's that aspect of why they do that. The question of the occupation, of imagining the occupation. Now, we're all sitting here in this room. How would it be different if suddenly soldiers came and they sort of surrounded us or stood at the back there, and then if you went out, you might or might not be allowed out. Then if you went out, you're not sure whether you would or would not be alive at the end of the day. To get from here to, say, somewhere else, there would be all these barriers. You would have to constantly keep proving your identity. It's just, and then on top of that, either you or lots of people that you know are disabled, disabled by actions of armed forces brutality, or disappeared, or hurt, or injured. If you just begin to imagine that and keep adding these layers of how you would feel, that probably is what people in conflict zones live all the time, and I think it's our duty at every level to just never forget that, because that is quite important, and neither is and also the fact of how systematic it is. It is systematic because the thing that I find when I read about, say, in Palestine, what's happening in Palestine, and I read about Mbembe's concept of necropolitics and how it functions, I see a clear connection, and how one describes this state of occupation. If I can just end with reading a couple of lines, that so basically it's this concept of sovereignty, where sovereignty means the ability to decide whether someone lives or dies, the politics of death. So essentially you're deciding whether someone can live or die. I have if I can locate it, yes. So this is not about Kashmir, but if you read it, if you hear it, it'll give you a sense. The besieged villages and towns are sealed off and cut off from the world. Daily life is militarized. Freedom is given to local military commanders to use their discretion as to when and whom to shoot. Movement between the territorial cells requires formal permits. Local civic institutions are systematically destroyed. The besieged population is deprived of their means of income. Invisible killing is added to outright executions. Secondly, to live under late modern occupation is to experience a permanent condition of being in pain. Fortified structures, military posts, and roadblocks everywhere, buildings that bring back painful memories of humiliation, interrogations, and beatings, curfews that imprison hundreds of thousands in their cramped homes every night from dusk to daybreak, soldiers patrolling the unlit streets, frightened by their own shadows, children blinded by rubber bullets, parents shamed and beaten in front of their families, soldiers urinating on fences, shooting at the rooftop, water tanks just for fun, chanting loud offensive slogans, pounding on fragile tin doors to frighten the children, confiscating papers, or dumping garbage in the middle of a residential neighborhood, border guards kicking over a vegetable stand, or closing borders at whim, bones broken, shootings and fatalities, a certain kind of madness. So what I'm saying is that in this concept, Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, I think is very, very applicable in the case of Kashmir, because what is happening is that this fundamental distinction that modernity has between reason and unreason has been blown apart. And what we see is the exercise of sovereignty as a means of the sovereignty lies in being able to decide who gets to live and who doesn't.
Victoria, I mean, yeah, in fact, I wanted to ask, you could speak on anything, but specifically one thing I needed to find out, or we wanted to discuss is, I mean, coming back to now, why? You recognize that there was a balance between the territorial framing of the conflict and the need for aspirations of the people. But what has happened in India and Pakistan, that they refuse to acknowledge the people's existence, that it's all about territory now. So when, for instance, what's his name? Oh, Narendra Modi, yeah. When the new Prime Minister of India, the right-wing fascist, and of course the
How could you possibly forget the name of your
no, he's not my,
enthroned Prime Minister?
Oh, no, he's not my newly enthroned Prime Minister. I have another equally repugnant figure, David Cameron, but let's not talk of them. In terms of India and Pakistan, I mean, could you say more on why is, for instance, for India, Kashmir is a small territory, even if you took an example of territory only. Why is it so obsessed about it? Why is it so almost sadist and even self-harming, given that it claims Kashmir to be integral part, but doesn't mind disfiguring that part? So what is in Kashmir that India is so obsessed about?
Well, I mean, it is the crux of the matter. You've seen the breakup of the Soviet Union, and I know that was a very inspirational moment when the Soviet Union broke up and Kashmiris felt, well, the independence stands, why can we not be independent? Unfortunately, I think what we see in history, and it's whether it's a democracy, whatever kind of state, no country really gives up territory voluntarily. And given that Pakistan is occupying 1/3, and there are many, I've sat in conferences where many criticism also comes on the government of Pakistan, that they're equally occupying 1/3 of the state. India is occupying 2/3 of the state. And so this is where we get back to the underlying aspect that it is actually a territorial dispute overlaid with talking about human rights aspirations of the people. But nonetheless, it remains a straight issue between the two countries that neither one of them, and we have to include Pakistan here, wants to give up land which it perceives to be of strategic interest. Yes, there's no oil there, but nonetheless, this territory is strategically located. We haven't mentioned water and the water issue and the headwaters of the Indus River, which runs from Tibet right through down through Kashmir. Equally, both countries are nervous about their relationship with China. Pakistan has constructed the Karakoram Highway through Gilgit-Baltistan, which is not part of Jammu and Kashmir administratively, but it is part of the former state of Jammu and Kashmir. And for Pakistan, this remains a very strategic link with China, a land link up through to Kunjarab. So, as I say, while we get very sort of expansive talking about the rights of individuals, when you're at government level, divorced from worrying about, as Nitasha has made very clear, worrying about the individuals, you're actually looking at these pieces of land on the map, how strategically located they are in terms of protecting your own borders, your own sovereignty. As we know, China and India have had a border dispute going on. And so I'm afraid it's one tends to think one gets more civilized as we move into the 21st century, but actually it's hard, fast, territorial, holding on to territory, because it appears to be, in the shorthand, one can be more detailed strategically. And while I've been listening to everybody talk, I think there's two things that have sort of remained in my mind. Tavleen Singh, who was an Indian journalist, but she wrote a book called Tragedy of Errors, and it was sort of one of the first Indians, actually, in the 90s, to wake up and think that, actually India has not handled Kashmir very well. You're saying, why do they brutalize people they want to keep within the Indian Union? And this statement that she wrote, which, as I say, stayed in my mind, is Kashmir will always be special, and we talk about its special status, but it'll always be suspect. And this kind of permeates the way that India deals with it. It's heavy-handed because it's special, but it's suspect. And when I was compiling interviews for my book in the 90s, I remember I went to see I.K. Gujral before he was Prime Minister. And again, it was a sort of exchange I had with him which has stayed with me all the time, because he said he was describing a meeting. I think he was private political secretary to Indira Gandhi at the time, and he was witnessing a conversation between Indira Gandhi and G.M. Sadiq. And this is in the 60s. This is going back in time. And G.M. Sadiq was saying to the Prime Minister, if I gave you reasons why you should look at the political development of Kashmir, why you should invest, why you should create jobs, why you should do this, you'd give me 24 reasons why you couldn't do it. But if I told you there was a law and order situation in Kashmir, within 24 hours you'd have 2 divisions of troops up there. And I.K. Gujral then went on, he was describing that conversation, he went on to say to me, sadly, this is how we have dealt with Kashmir. And I cite this story because I think it's very illustrative of how the government of India has dealt with Kashmir. As I say, in answer to the territorial aspect, there are no heroes in this story at government level. And I make that point, as I say, for both countries. They say one thing, but actually they sort of mean another. And this is the state we're at, where going back to 47 and talking about the aspirations of the people, it runs as a sub-theme to what essentially has remained a territorial dispute.
Briefly, Mary, while small point of difference, yes, the origins are territorial and geopolitical, and as they have carried on with their geopolitical aspirations, both India and Pakistan, but that is the problem. That is why there is no solution in sight, because you keep looking at this place as a territory to be carved up between the two countries or annexed by one power or the other. Isn't it proof enough that those positions, those territorial positions, haven't worked for anyone? Not even for the interests of India and Pakistan either. Is there peace between the two countries? No. Are they friends? Are they, going to parties together? Not really. And the reason is this: that you keep harping on the territorial aspect of this. Yes, origins are territorial, but the history goes back as well. There has been an aspiration for an independent state for a long, long time. And when you keep ignoring that there are these people in that space, and Nitasha talked about sovereignty, and these people who have categorically, completely rejected India's sovereignty over Kashmir. So you cannot envisage a solution or a framework where Kashmir may be peacefully resolved if you keep looking at it this way.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't think there's a point of difference. I actually agree with you, and this is where we're in this stalemate, because while the prism of viewing is merely that this is a piece of land that we both want, but we've not, neither of us have got entirely, you are stuck in the position, in the narrative, which you were in originally. And it's not involving, and as you rightly said at the beginning, not bringing the Kashmiris and by this I mean all the inhabitants of the state. We loosely call them Kashmiris, but as we know, they are, other different, there's Sudans, there's Punjis, there's Gujars, there's Bakawals, there's Gilgitis, there's Baltistan. The entire inhabitants to the state, you remain sort of stuck literally on the horns of the dilemma. So I think, but it's, when you talk about states creating the narrative, as Nitasha did also with the media, and their control of sovereignty, they call the shots. And we haven't really brought in the international community. The international community is impotent because it doesn't feel, it doesn't make itself empowered to enter into the debate other than what's already on the table.
They have their interest. They want big
They've
business.
also got their interest.
They go to India and they want big business deals. Why would they? If you remember, famously or infamously, I should say, President Obama before he was elected, would do the famous. I hate the acronymization of Kashmir when they use it. They call it K word or something, which sounds like sometimes an insult. He dropped the K word because he came back with lots of deals. Same for Prime Minister Cameron. He went to India and came back with lots of defense deals, if I remember correctly. So they have those...
Yes, I'm afraid. There are no heroes.
Actually, there are lots of people with blood on their hands.
Yes.
But no heroes at all.
No
There's
heroes.
lots and lots
at
of
government level, the heroes are people like Parvina and other very brave people, but they're the grassroots at the ground level.
Yeah.
The international community, I was saying that the international dimension is going to be even lesser in the future. I mean, there are some people here who are, Conciliation Resources and Kashmir Development Foundation. They had this meeting in the Parliament, in the British Parliament, and several members of Parliament came to that meeting, and they were talking about, this was about, what the Pakistan side of Kashmir. So that is what it was primarily focused on. I mean, that is where most of the people were there from. So there was this member of Parliament who said that he'd been in, at some meeting or somewhere, he'd met this person from the Pentagon and lots of these other people who said, Kashmir is not even in the top 20. When we think about where in the world the problems lie, it's here, blah, blah. Kashmir is not even in, not even even in our range of what we need to be thinking about. So it's this unfortunate situation of this disjuncture between Kashmir as territory and Kashmiris as people, and until and unless there were at least some starting point of some ground facts that people could, the people who need to talk about could agree on and involve the people on, the actual Kashmiris, it seems that chasm.
In fact, I also look at, what's happening in Kashmir is, of course, something similar to Tibet, which is an area of bigger interest for me, but something similar, again, where states talk of territory as integral but not of people. Now, one thing, I would like to reflect, and then we'll open up for question answers, that it hasn't worked for India and Pakistan, but, it has worked for Indian military and Pakistani military. They don't, in a sense, peace is a bad business for them, unless they talk of very vacuous kind of peace, In certain sense, do you know that basically it benefits a lot of vested interests, both in India and Pakistan, to hang on to the territorial vision, because that's what they're good at, and that's what benefits them. So, could you say more? Because, some people may not even know that Kashmir is one of the world's most militarized zones. They may not even know that maybe 80,000 plus people were killed in 1990s. And they were and thousands have been disappeared. So they might not know the extent of it. I'm just wondering that is it simply? What am I wondering? Could you say more on why? Who in India might be benefiting from the status quo in Kashmir? What kind of actors? Media, yes. And as you rightly pointed out, very interesting. India is known for vibrant media, but when it comes to Kashmir, the state narrative and the media narrative is almost the same. Yeah, so, what kind of actors would benefit from the status quo?
I don't think it's about specific actors so much as it is about the state itself. There is a deeply entrenched position at the heart of the Indian states vis-a-vis Kashmir, and all the players, irrespective of their small political differences or allegiances to a certain way of thinking, adhere to that position. It is not, I don't think it's a matter of seasonal opinion in the corridors of power in India that determines choices on Kashmir. It is a policy. It is at the heart of the Indian state's Kashmir policy that we will not let go of this place, which, if it's repeated over and over for decades, permeates to the level of the public as well. Especially because if it's the official narratives are aided wonderfully, willingly, by many sections of the Indian media. I must say, not all. There are small churnings in India, to say a few good things about. There are small churnings here and there in sections of media, in sections of civil society, in academia, in small journalistic circles who are, willing to depart from those odious official narratives. It is at the heart of the state, the policy, that this is, if you go to Kashmir, you may even see graffiti on military camps, which actually say it in as many words. We are not interested in Kashmiris. We're interested in Kashmir. I have actually seen it, which is bizarre. That one, you do this, and then you are perfectly fine with advertising it to the world. That or there was another graffiti, quite horrendous, in a military camp, which said, if you want their hearts and minds, grab them by their balls. Something like that. And this is this crass grammar that is used. So, which tells me it is not, it's not a matter of opinion here and there. This is at the heart of the state. I want to say one small thing, what they do, what this occupation with hundreds and thousands of soldiers, that is not the only thing. It's not the numbers. It is the big beast, the engine of occupation. I was traveling inside Kashmir last year, and I spent some time in the heart of the city, and I saw lines of houses being demolished in downtown Srinagar. And this has happened, when I grew up, it used to happen. And the phrase you hear is that this is to decongest densely populated areas of Srinagar, also, for instance, Old Town Baramulla. And you begin to think, it used to happen when I was young as well. Then you explore it further. But it's actually more vicious and sinister than that. This is not plain development or simple decongestion of densely populated areas. They're disrupting communities, tearing them apart, because these are known old towns or pockets of resistance, as they're called. So what they want to do is they want to cut that tapestry of resistance. They want to destroy those links, because old towns in Kashmir, in many parts of South Asia, are densely populated. People live in close proximity. There is internal traffic between houses and lanes and bylanes and waterways and so forth. This is recent, and I've seen it myself, that they, in the name of decongestion, they remove lines of houses through pockets in Srinagar and other towns, because they know that these are the areas where these boys, these protesters, dissenters come from. So what do we do? Just remove it physically, or disrupt it physically, ruin it. And then you couple it with other schemes, as the railways. You try to have so they're trying to reimagine, remake this place in the image of mainland India. But as I said, people see it. People are not. If you grow up in a place like Kashmir, you're a political being, whether you like it or not. You do not have a choice. That's what you become. That's what you are. The idea that whether to be a political or apolitical person, it doesn't occur to you. And you see it. The question, I get asked this quite often when you write, because I'm a novelist as well, sometimes. And then you get asked that, you write political stuff, and what about art and aesthetics and literature? And I said, yes, I do write literature, but the idea whether I'm going to do a political book or not does not occur to a person who's grown up, whose sensibility is formed in that space. It's like I don't want to sound grand. In South American literature, for instance, nobody asked them that why do you write political novels or political literature or stories that feature dictators or brutal army people or so on and so forth. It's what happens. I have diverted.
No, in fact, no, that's very much part of the conversation. Very quick comment from Nitasha before we open to question answer. Nitasha, this, in India, of course, and you raised an important question of how, for instance, and you referred to this case of 2 Dalit girls being raped and hanged from trees, right? Some protest, but not much will happen, because that kind of things happens again and again. There's certain kind of brutalization that's part and parcel of every aspect, to be honest, of India, Pakistan, and South Asian lives. Now, could you say a bit, and then we'll open to question answers, on the Hinduization of Indian polity that's taking place that may frame Kashmir dispute as largely a Muslim dispute, as a Hindu-Muslim. What does it do? Because, of course, Kashmir also has its own Hindu population, apart from Sikh population. So what does this Hinduization or and Islamophobic discourse on Kashmir do to the people of Kashmir, do to the people of Kashmir?
Well, the transmission and exercise of power is most effective from the point of view of whatever the central exercise of power is supposed to be. If the simpler, the lesser nuances there are identity-wise, or the lesser complications there are on the way in which power is channelized through society in various conflicts. And when we look at the Indian case, of course, if you polarize it as a Hindu-Muslim issue, then you automatically there are already these imaginaries that already exist and historically, and all you have to do is map on this this present content to that. You don't have to actually think from within the content of this particular conflict. You can simply add it on to what is already there, which is Hindus this, Muslims this, majority minority. So and this is a government, the current government in India is a government that is built on massacre. It's coming to power through the last decade is traced through everything starting from Gujarat, and in the name of development, everybody conveniently forgetting the difference between growth and development. And in these last 10 years, there's been this, not the last 10 years, well, the last 20 years, since, in the 1991, when there was liberalization in what was called liberalization in India, and the opening up of the Indian economy. Since then, what has happened is that, not only has inequality grown, but there's been this excessive, parallel to that, there's been this excessive Hinduization. This is also happening, early 90s is also when, all these Rath Yatras and the Babri Masjid and all of that is happening at the same time in the Indian, society and psyche. So there has been this growing polarization, and it's reflected in India. And it's reflected, and it becomes a performative thing in that it brings into being what it names. The more you say it is a Hindu-Muslim issue, the more people are going to think and align along those lines, and that's what's happening. So you polarize the discourse, and I think that is why it is very difficult for voices that do not see it in those terms, for them to be heard sensibly, without being called either traitorous or problematic or something like that. Because if you are, say, if you are a progressive and seditious, all of that. So if you are a progressive and you want to talk about the problems of, say, the Kashmiri Hindus who who don't live there anymore, most of them, in the valley and in Kashmir. So if you want to talk about that from a progressive point of view, you're not heard, because those voices have been co-opted by the right the right wing and the far right in India, because they have fed into this majoritarian nationalist narrative of this is a problem of the Muslims doing this to the Hindus. And and likewise, there's probably polarization at the other end as well. So polarization along the lines of religion is not going to help, because it's the India and Pakistan itself, the very idea of the two-nation theory and all of that is, you go there and you then start, unpicking, and you look at this whole big narrative of how, people are, how people get divided. So it's and this in general the Hinduization is also linked to a certain kind of vigilante mentality that you see more and more in India now of people. I was just today morning, some people, two boys accused of theft being stripped naked, tied to by motorcycles and paraded. So this whole kind of people being in every realm, people just being extremely brutalized, and the fact that everyone chooses to ignore that a guy who's been in RSS all his life is now the Prime Minister, and that every time he does something there are all these people behind him, the Shiv Sena and all of these who have this these far right voices. We have to just work a lot harder to keep people to think about the fact that there is humanity and progressive secular voices that talk about people's rights. Not just in those denominational terms.
Thank you.
The religious, to have a minute. The religious dimension is a fact. We obviously don't want extreme polarization, but people in Kashmir have been Muslims for a long time, and many of them have seen the occupation of Kashmir not as an occupation by a secular Indian state. They have seen it as an occupation by a Hindu state. Now, when we, and one of the key question, or the key questions is, Kashmiri Pandits who lived in Kashmir for centuries, Hindus, they don't live there anymore because in 1990 they left Kashmir. It was an exodus because some of them were targeted by militants of a certain denomination. One has to kind of recognize that too as a fact. Some of them were killed, and there was an atmosphere of fear, and they left.
Which
now,
Jagmohan built upon. And he fostered that atmosphere.
Yes, and the then governor of Kashmir, a man called Jagmohan, I have written wonderfully about him in my novel, with great praise, of course. He helped this exodus. It he made sure that those people left. But at the same time, the Kashmiri Pandits were scared. Some of them were killed. And their return to Kashmir is, equally important. It is an inalienable right to return to their home, simply put, and it should happen. And I think it will happen at some point. Many of them don't want to return, not because they don't want to go back home, but they have built lives outside of Kashmir, for other reasons. Some of them may not want to, but they do. I mean, to lose home is one of the biggest tragedies anyone can experience. To lose home, not just home physical, the idea of home, that space you belong to. But they will return. I hope they return, and that is part of
that's part and parcel of those challenges for Kashmiris.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, they are Kashmiris. I mean, one shouldn't have to state this.
Yeah. I know.
It should not need saying that they are Kashmiris, but.
Okay. Should we? In fact, we'll have time for. We'll take 4 or 5 questions together, and the panel can answer that. So, who would want to start? So, Greg, here.
I have a comment rather than a question. Dr. Nitasha Kaul mentioned Indian democracy as it applies to Kashmir. And the consequences of it we see in the slides and images above. And what Mirza Waheed was just now talking about, decongestion of the streets, which we have seen in Xinjiang province as well, what China was doing with the Uyghurs. If you talk to Kashmiris there, they will, one of the other reasons they will also give is that the streets are now wider so that the military vehicles can pass easily. Yeah. But coming back to the Indian democracy as applied to Kashmir, I have a term for it. I thought you might like to hear it. It's post-traumatic democracy disorder. And that's what Kashmir is suffering from these days.
That's very well said.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Anyone?
Thank you. My name is Irshad Malik. I am from Indian side of Kashmir, Baramulla. So a little question. As you said that the Pandits, our brothers, they have the right to come back to their homes. But there is a portion of the people who are now residing in Pakistani side of Kashmir. And they left also in 1990. So what do you suggest for them? Because either they need the passport to go back, or because there is a border. There is no border between Jammu or India and Srinagar. But there is a border between Srinagar or Baramulla and Azad Kashmir. So what do you suggest? What should they do? They have families now there, and they want to go back to either Baramulla, Kopwara, or Srinagar.
Okay, we'll take a few questions together. No? Anyone?
Because I think there are some students as well. Most of the debate has been India dominant factor, and it seems maybe for some people that Pakistan also controls some part, and the things are on right. So there should be some, you can say, discussion on that aspect, that what Pakistan is doing their controlled territory, Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Kashmir, which is Pakistan administrative Kashmir. So there should be some opinion on that one as well.
2 more questions and then we'll answer. I'll repeat. Okay, please. I'll repeat the question. I remember.
Thank you. Mike O'Farrell, you've painted a slightly dystopian picture about the future. Given the change in the international order and the fact that China is now exhibiting much more power than it did before, could you foresee an occasion when China's influence would persuade Pakistan to take another look at the relationship?
There's something wrong with the audio.
Yeah, I know. We'll take one last. Well, Greg. Oh, then 2 questions. And keep the microphone a bit away, because if it's too close, it's not becoming clear.
I was wondering, I think it's been said before that most of the protesters are teenagers or in their 20s, and I was wondering why that is and why aren't there like older people protesting on the street?
Okay, and last question there, the gentleman there.
Thank you very much. I'm from Pakistan side of Kashmir, Azad Kashmir. We've been discussing more about Indian torture and occupation. I want to hear more about how they're controlling society on both sides, India and Pakistan. Like, just entered the conference and one of my friends, he started speaking Kashmiri. I don't know Kashmiri. I am Kashmiri, but can't speak Kashmiri. So I want to know about how India and Pakistan, the impact on Kashmiris, their hearts and minds, and social institutions utilizing different tactics. How they confusing Kashmiris or how they like controlling them.
Okay,
socially.
Thank you. Quick question? Okay.
I just wanted, it was a question to all the panelists, but one of my observations has been that very often, this happened in the lead up to Modi's elections as well, liberals, the left and left-leaning liberals tend to talk to themselves a lot. And I think in a lot of events on Kashmir, I think one thing that civil society isn't very good about doing is actually talking to people who disagree with us. Like in most events, you hardly have anybody actually providing the other perspective, whether it's the right-wing perspective or the Indian perspective on it. And I just wanted to get some thoughts on that.
I would love to hear the other's perspective.
No, okay, the questions I'll repeat because some of you may not have gotten. One was, okay, fine to talk of Pandits' right to return back. It's easier for them. What about the, let's say, other Kashmiris who are stuck in, not stuck, who are living on the other side, so the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir rather than Indian-occupied Kashmir? What about return of them? Because there's an international border.
Take them one by one.
Okay. So, do you remember the question?
No, you mentioned
okay.
one. We take
okay.
that one. And
okay, fine. One is about, we have 10 minutes, we'll have to be brief. Yeah. So, one is Pandit's right to return. What about rights of return of those who are on the other side of the border?
There was a scheme announced by the local government in Indian administered Kashmir, which according to which the return of those people who are in Pakistani administered Kashmir would be facilitated. And many of those were either former militants or who sort of, carried on living there and have families, or people who just left as refugees. I remember the time, who left Indian Kashmir when the war was at the peak and crossed over to live on the other side of Kashmir. They have a right to return as like anyone else. I wish I had the mechanism or structures to make it possible. I would do it now, But the scheme that the government announced didn't really work well because the people who come back via that scheme haven't really been given enough support to restart their lives. Some of them, if press reports are right, have regretted the decision because they don't have jobs, they don't have employment, their children can't find this. It's a very recent thing, but not many big numbers. But I would also envisage a future when this border, this silly, bizarre line of control disappears. Then people can just go wherever they want to go, and it should disappear because it's one of the most absurd borders in the world. It's just literally cuts villages in half, rivers on the other side. Many years ago, very briefly, I was at the BBC. This is to do how Pakistan manages Kashmir. It's very different. You won't see overt brutalization on the streets. You won't see Pakistani army firing on 50 people in Pakistan and Kashmir. They're cleverer. as far as I have understood. I used to work at the BBC. They're cleverer. It is said that a major of the ISI, is it okay to take names of dreaded intelligence agencies?
Why not? You should.
Yeah. Has more power in that part of Kashmir than a minister. It is said, they have a government, of course, but that said, I do not remember the last time the Pakistani forces, security forces, armed forces, killing 50 people or 100 people in Pakistan and Western Kashmir, if you know what I'm trying to say. They do other things. They have complete control over what goes on there. But the people of that part of Kashmir haven't suffered the kind of brutalization that Kashmiris on the other side have suffered at the hands of the Indian armed forces.
Now, Victor, I know we have questions. I mean, on this part, because a couple of them raised about the Pakistan occupied along with the Indian occupied. I mean, if, for instance, could one make the argument that has Pakistan really more clever in how they control it, or is it that fact that if people on that side also take up arms to resist the state, maybe the Pakistani state would be as brutal as the Indian state? I mean, I'm just wondering whether
yes, well, I mean, we have to look at
but they haven't
the
been given
example of
reason to rise
Bangladesh.
up with arms. They haven't risen up in arms against the Pakistani state.
they haven't been okay.
Yes, no, but I mean, I think the question of brutalization is apparent in terms of how hard Pakistan tried to hold on to Bangladesh. I mean, I don't. Again, it's a theoretical question, but in answer to both the questioners who wanted to talk about Azad Kashmir, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, as it should rightly be called, it's true there has not been the movement. I mean, it's a little bit chicken and egg because there hasn't been the repression and consequently the movement against the repression. There hasn't been the same movement for independence. Or for, I mean, there's certainly not been a movement for that side to go to India, so the only movement of protest would be the movement of independence. I think Pakistan has handled the situation slightly better in terms of retaining the prime minister, retaining a president. There are the trappings of, so to speak, more independent sort of political administrative setup. However, all is not well either in AJK because there is a long-standing dispute about the water rights in terms of the Mangla Dam. And there's, if you're on the ground in AJK, you'll find people who will be annoyed and more than annoyed at the way their resources have been handled. And of course, as in both societies, there will be people at the top happy to occupy positions. And they get their own vested interest in perpetuating the status quo because it suits them. So you don't get a movement going because you've got the indigenous individuals who are happy to retain the status quo. But as I say, water is an issue also in AJK and the whole creation of the Mangla Dam. But one interesting point, we've not talked at all about the Chatham House report, which was 2010. It was defective in that it didn't include everywhere and it was only a small sample, but there was a report produced under the auspices of Chatham House, and one of the statistics which came out was that 50% of the inhabitants of AJK voted for being part of Pakistan, which therefore meant that 50% would have preferred to be independent. But it's sort of, there's only sort of just over 1 million people in AJK. It doesn't run like the independence movement in the Valley of Kashmir. In addition to which, the character of AJK is different, whereas in the two-thirds under Indian administration, you've got the distinct area of Ladakh, you've got the area of Jammu, and you've got the valley. I mean, these three administratively distinct areas. In AJK, as we know, it's a small territory. You've got the bigger territory of Gilgit-Baltistan, what was the former northern areas, and administratively, it's always been separate. It's not been under the same administration. And I think, again, when one wants to know about the history of the area, it's true to say the Gilgitis, the Baltis, have not had the same, again, impetus If anything, they've wanted greater independence as an entity of their own. And there is the Balawaristan National Front. It's not got very much support. Again, it's not a very heavily populated area. And they have actually more issues between the Shias and the Sunni population in Gilgit-Baltistan. And it's one of the reasons why it's not been put together with AJK. It's partly a religious issue there. But it's not really been part of the independence movement at all. And so it doesn't catch our attention. It's not part of the narrative. But as I say, it's not as though everything is right within that area in terms of the people's rights. But equally, I think if Pakistan were challenged, they would hang on to it. And I made this point earlier, as much as India hangs on to it, because strategically, that area, Gilgit-Baltistan, is very important for Pakistan.
Far from it, very quick, there's a report. I mean, not a lot of work has been done on what goes on in the other part of Kashmir. Human Rights Watch did a very detailed report a few years ago called With Friends Like These. It's a great title. It tells you a lot. It details what the Pakistani security establishment, how it deals with nationalist sentiment within that part of Kashmir, because they have categories. There are people who are okay with Pakistani state sovereignty in there, but there are people who want to be part of independent Kashmir, as Victoria rightly said. They are the people who are targeted by the Pakistani state. They are subjected to all kinds of pressures, sometimes detention, illegal detention, sometimes even torture. It's all in that report. It's called Friends Like These, a very, very chilling, brilliant report.
But equally, you know, the person sort of who really was in the forefront of this was Amanullah Khan. He does live safely in Rawalpindi, but he's very much made the point that as a founder member of the JKLF, the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, he cannot contest elections in AJK, and that is, you know, we hear a lot from the Hurriyat that they refuse to contest the elections in Jammu and Kashmir because they don't want to concede that Jammu and Kashmir is part of the Indian Union. But the same applies in AJK. You can't contest elections in AJK unless you accept that AJK is part of Pakistan.
The government there doesn't really have real power. One has to remember that.
Yeah, and the constitution is very clear that though it's called Azad Kashmir, they have no Azadi to choose Azadi, which is independence, but they have to work towards working part of
again,
Pakistan.
I think it's interesting to point out, you know, for the students that Azad Jammu and Kashmir was so named because it was to be the free government of Jammu and Kashmir in the anticipation that the whole state would be put together once the plebiscite had been held. And so it was sort of the seat of government initially. And then it became the government and it became the name of that region.
Okay.
Yeah. As we speak now, no part of Kashmir is Azad, in a sense, as how I see it. No part of Kashmir is really Azad.
No, Nitasha, we have to finish this for this section. I mean,
Look at the question.
yeah, I mean, I'll tell you the question and then answer, because one question was related to... one part was Pakistan occupied, which people have already answered. Why teenagers? Why this targeting of teenagers was something no one has answered so far. Rise of China, will it have any impact on India, Pakistan and Kashmir? And finally, left liberals, how do they talk to each other? Maybe I can answer that, because I guess this also targets why did we choose the kind of people we choose for this. So I'll answer that at the end. No, I want to answer that.
Did you vote?
What vote? I mean, so very quickly, because we are running late.
Just to respond to all of that, yes, absolutely. The line of control is a gash that cuts through land. It is the line of control, as I always point out. The control part is important. It is the line that is meant to do that. It's as to get West's attention. It's sometimes called Asia's Berlin Wall. There are, the narrative runs who's the real victim or who's the bigger victim. That's often the terms on which the narrative has to be cast in order to get the attention, in order to get, in order to basically get the attention or the resources or any of that. That's how you have to, how people articulate it. So it's often the case that there are people talking about the occupation, and then there are people talking about the displacement and the exile, you know, the Hindus, and of what it feels like to live in a refugee camp for over a decade, and to kind of the deprivations that you have to do, and one sees that in the 90s what happened, and all these people who had to be away from their home, who couldn't speak Hindi, who didn't know, to whom it was literally like an alien country in every way, from temperature to language, and they were suddenly thrown, into the deep end, and they had to then make their lives anew, and that should not be diminished either. So, I mean, what I wish for is this solidarity. If we could just have the solidarity between Kashmiris of any religion to say that this is a problem of state failure in relation to Kashmir, be it Kashmir, in relation to Kashmir and Kashmiris, be it Kashmiri Hindus or Kashmiri Muslims, if we could just have those voices of solidarity, then I think we would actually move forward, because with that we could also cut across this India-Pakistan talking to each other narrative. Then you'd have a sensible voice. Right now those voices are divided, and I think that lack of that solidarity between Kashmiri Hindus and Kashmiri Muslims is to me a big problem. On the other questions, and I'll just answer all of them at once, the return aspect, yes, absolutely. People have a connection to a place, whether they want to live there or not. Even those who don't want to live there anymore should have to go back. And today, I mean, I think today or yesterday, the new government announced that they're going to have these plans to rehabilitate Kashmiri Hindus back in places like Srinagar, and they've emphasized, one will see how it unfolds, but they've emphasized they don't want them to be living in ghettos, the Kashmiri Pandits who go back, and they want to integrate them everywhere within Kashmir, but I mean, one will wait and see. The other thing they've done is that they're now going to call Pakistan occupied Kashmir, the new government in India is going to call it Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir in every literature, everything, all of its publications. So, I mean, one will, one has to see where that goes. In terms of historically what has happened in states like Kashmir, it has been a gradual erosion of sovereignty that Kashmir started out with. It has so much less of that. China's influence on Pakistan for making the situation better with India, I don't think one could sort of a priori assume that that would be the case, because I think the only thing one can assume is that the interests of India, China, Pakistan, primarily the consonance of their interests would be on the matters, on economic matters and on matters of trade. And India, China have a huge amount of trade, but that hasn't helped the boundary issue got solved even since the trade began. So it's not clear that even if the trade progresses, that would automatically lead to a solution of other issues. They could just get sidelined in some particular manner. I don't think we can assume that. Regarding the generational issues, why don't the older people protest? I think everyone protests, but we just get to see these pictures of what are, we get the stone pelters, the young miscreants. I think at every level of society, people are very, very unhappy and resist that. The other point was really interesting. How do we control societies? Like, people say if you're not Kashmiri, if you can't speak Kashmiri. I think that is a very, very interesting point, because, this whole thing of how do you define an identity, and that if you can't speak Kashmiri, you can't be real. I mean, in my novel Residue, I have this character who's a Kashmiri Muslim from India who looks at Kashmiris from the Pakistan side, and he, in spite of everything he's faced, can't see them as Kashmiri, because to him, if you can't speak Kashmiri, you're not really Kashmiri. You must be somebody else. So there is that. And obviously we should. That's why the pan-Kashmiri identity is really essential. The solidarity part. Finally, why don't we have people who disagree? Because I think because one finds it so difficult often to talk to a lot of the people who disagree. I'm now talking about, say, the Hindu right, but presumably could apply to any kind of far right, is that it's just so much ad hominem, personal trolling kind of behavior. I mean, certainly on online social media and stuff like that. It's just very, very vitriolic, and you don't get that kind of conversation happening. There should obviously be media spaces where that is made possible between people who can move the discourse forward, and that should happen, because that's an essential step.
Quickly, when I said teenagers and young people, they come out in the streets to protest, to throw stones, because there's nothing else they can do. That's the last sort of thing left to them. But women in Kashmir come out to protest on the streets and push to the wall. They come up and face battalions of soldiers on the streets marching at them, very bravely and courageously and with dignity. Liberal left. What liberal left? It's been shocking, as all of us know. Some of them have turned into Modi fanboys overnight. So it'll take a while. But no disrespect. Yes, we should have people of various kind of views and different views, and and there are people who may be on the other side of the argument, but they are,
we will remember that I chaired a panel when there were people at the Frontline Club, and we nearly had a mini world war.
I was part of it.
Yes, and Mirza was part of it, and the way they had 4 people, and I was chairing it, and I can tell you it was so hostile, and it was difficult, and you lost actually part of the essence of the discussion because it was people just getting angry at each other, and
it nearly became a shouting match. I stayed calm. I tried to stay calm.
And the way I would explain. This is partly because look, there's very little energy and opportunity one gets to do these kinds of discussions, and. For instance, our purpose was not to try to cover all the views, because that's almost not possible. Or even for that matter, why not Pakistan side, not Balti side or Ladakh side. But even in terms of politics, because quite a few of my friends did say, oh, it's all, Azadi people, it's all anti-India people. I said, that's not my problem. Partly maybe that reflects my own bias. I am a supporter of Azadi very full-fledgedly, right? Maybe that reflects it. But it's more about that. If we get an opportunity for a day, and we have limited resources and time and energy, it's important to have a proper conversation and remember, the purpose is to remind that Kashmiris exist as people. Now, the Indian nationalist narrative doesn't even acknowledge that. So what's the point of even discussing with them? That's the rationale. Now, we have only a couple of minutes. I know it was supposed to be a bigger session. I'm sorry, but we are running out of time. This was the release of Nitasha's novel. The copy is there. Please feel free. You have to pay with cash. It's inexpensive. But Mirza has been reading it. So I'll leave it to you.
It's a lovely book, and I should I ask you all to read it. And there are copies. I hope she has enough copies. I'm reading it and I'm loving it. I was telling Nitasha there was slightly startling echoes of my younger life in the first few pages, because I went to the same colleges as one of the lead characters went to, and had the same dilemmas of people being called arty, and what are you doing, why are you studying literature, and so forth. But beyond that, it's a meditation on identity. It's so far what I have read until now, and of possible futures of people who come from a culture, go into another culture, encounter different cultures and different people, and then their constant, to use a bad word, search for home and themselves. Vis-a-vis, the story is told from the point of view, there is a Kashmiri character who's not grown up there, is grown up somewhere else, but has roots in Kashmir, thinks about Kashmir. But by way of thinking about Kashmir, it is not just a Kashmir story. That's not a bad thing to say. It's a story about one person's quest as well for meaning, and in a political sort of framework. I should finish the book soon and say more.
And we'll have a proper book launch then and a discussion on the book. Thank you. This is your book.
Please, you should.
Thank you, and thank you, Victoria, Mirza, and Nitasha.
Thank you for having us.
No. And now.